So today I'm going to give a message that is more of a history lesson than a sermon.
Not recording yet.
Okay.
You need to start.
We'll let Jim get set up too.
Okay. Good.
All right, so this morning I'm going to give a message that's more of a history lesson than a sermon. Over the years I've compiled a lot of information, kind of apologetics information about the impact of photographs, because a lot of us take part in educating people about the plight of the murdered preborn, and inevitably when you're out on the streets ministering with a disturbing sign of an aborted baby, people will complain, you're not doing it right, this is you're not the time or the place, or that you're not being effective with the methods you're using. You hear all kinds of complaints like that, so this is a bit of an apologetic against that. It's interesting some of the comments you hear when you're out on the streets. We were out Friday night, and at the same event, we heard a man tell us that we had to shut up because we didn't have a uterus. And we had a white woman yell at us that she didn't have to listen to us because we're just a bunch of white pricks. So, I mean, you can't fix stupid, but there are people that you can educate about why we do this with the photographs. So I like to compile things. I have a folder in my computer where when I finish reading a book, I'll take notes and add it to that folder. I'll download things, I'll scan things in there, articles I've read. So this is a combination of all of that, and you'll see a lot of quotes that I'll project up on the screen, and you can read along with me for a lot of this. So this is not something that's new to us, using victim imagery of aborted preborn babies. Almost from the time photography was invented, people have been using photographs to push for social change. And even though they knew these were disturbing photographs, they felt that it was necessary to tell us that. I think I forgot to turn on my wireless mic. Let me do that. Okay, that may help better. So we're going to take a look at some of the history behind how people have used photographs through history. First man we're going to look at is a man by the name of Jacob Riis. He was a Danish immigrant in the 1800s that came over to America. He was the third of 15 children, immigrated to America by steamer in 1870 when he was 21 years old. He went to America to look for employment as a carpenter to support himself, and he ended up just being another poor immigrant in New York. He spent a lot of his time in police-run poorhouses where he could afford to live, but conditions there were so ghastly that later on he dedicated himself to having them shut down, and that became one of the causes that he put a lot of his efforts towards. Through his own experiences in the poorhouse and witnessing the conditions of the poor in the city slums, he decided to make a difference for those who had no voice. This is one of the things he said in his own words. He said, "It was on my midnight trips to the slums with the sanitary police that the wish kept cropping up into me that there would be some way of putting before the people what I saw there. A drawing might have done it, but I cannot draw, never could. But anyway, a drawing would not have been the kind of evidence I wanted." Here's an example of one of the drawings that he later did put in his book, but it didn't have the kind of impact that he wanted. He wanted something that would really grab people's attention more. He added that when he wrote articles in his paper, it seemed to make no impression on people. Then one morning in 1887, he read in the paper that a German had discovered how to make photographs by using a magnesium powder flashlight, and he knew he had the answer. So he started making photographs. The photographs that he did were relatively primitive, but their roughness only heightened the sense of authenticity. They conveyed authenticity and reinforced what amounted to photographic shot tactics, as some people describe them. It was disturbing to people of his day to see these kind of conditions. He ended up making lantern slide projections out of his presentation, very similar to what we're doing today with a PowerPoint. So it was said that he was so convincing in his presentations that a Scribner's editor asked him for an article on the subject, and that led to him writing the book, How the Other Half Lives, where he published a lot of his photographs. It came out in 1890 with 17 half-tone reproductions of photographs and 19 wood engravings And it was so successful that it went through 11 printings in 5 years. Here's another one of his photographs from New York, from Mulberry Road. The title of his most famous work was called How the Other Half Lives. It was published in 1890, and it remains a simple description of the goal of traditional social photography, that being to awaken the conscience of the middle and upper classes by providing a glimpse into the lives of the lower classes. His work shocked most wealthy New Yorkers who had no idea that such a world existed just a few miles from their opulent neighborhoods. So again, no different from the response that we get today. People were shocked and they were outraged that he would do such a thing. His book was directly responsible for convincing then Commissioner of Police Teddy Roosevelt, before he became president, to close police-run poorhouses in which Reese suffered during his first months as an American. After reading the book, Roosevelt was so deeply moved by Reese's sense of justice that he met Reese and befriended him for life, and he called him the best American I ever knew. So the picture here is Reese actually walking behind Teddy Roosevelt's in the front, and Reese is walking behind him as they patrol the beat in New York, looking for civil rights violations in the slums. So this is a picture of the police lodging places, the poorhouses that Reese stayed in, these kinds of conditions, and they ended up shutting them down. Him and Roosevelt were instrumental in doing that. Depictions of the poor had always been coyly improved on because the reality was considered vulgar and repellent. The combination of photography and the lower class subjects was considered an affront in some quarters. A contemporary of Reese's wrote about seeing such materials in the newspapers, and he said, "Is it proper to sully the pages with rioting in the slums? Is it in the interest of purity in society that we should hang its morally stained linens upon those lines to be stared at?" Sounds pretty similar to the complaints we get today. And this isn't the time or place. Don't you know this is a family event? Why would you bring this out? You're airing laundry, dirty laundry in public type of arguments. One of his causes was the Mulberry Bend slum, perhaps the worst part of the worst slum in America. It was spoken of Charles Dickens by a shutter in 1842 in some of his writings. Reese attacked it for years in lectures and articles with photographs. It was a difficult one to work on people and get action on it. Once he said he went there at night with the sanitary police and he found fiercely overcrowded lodges where people slept for 5 cents a spot. When the report was submitted to the health board the next day, it did not make much of an impression. Like he said, "I can tell you in words, but it doesn't make much of an impression." So what did he do? He said, "These things rarely do put in mere words, but," he said, "until my negatives, still dripping from the darkroom, came to reinforce them, and then, from them, there was no appeal." It was not the only instance of its kind by a good many. Neither the landlord's protests nor the tenant's plea went in the face of the camera's evidence, and I was satisfied. In 1897, the Bend was torn down and a park opened on some of its darkest tenements. So he did make an impact with his photographs. He said he tried for years arguing this, telling people's words, but it didn't make much of an impact. And when he brought the photographs to those city council meetings and things, then things changed. People got it. Action was taken. And we hope for the same thing as we bring the murdered preborn out to people. That even though it's difficult to look at, even though it is shocking, yes, we hope that it motivates people to action. Another man that used photographs for great effect was Matthew Brady. Actually predated Jacob Riis, and he took a lot of his photographs during the Civil War. He was one of the earliest American photographers, and he's best known for his scenes of taking Civil War pictures. When the Civil War started, he used a mobile studio in a darkroom that enabled him to go right out to the battlefields and take photographs that brought home the reality of war to the public. It was said that thousands of war scenes were captured, as well as portraits of generals and politicians on both sides of the conflict, though most of these were taken by his assistants rather than by Brady himself. His battlefield photography made a large impression on the public, bringing home the reality of war in a way that paintings or newspapers never could. And the New York Times wrote an article about his photography in October 20th, 1862. This is how they described it. First, they gave kind of an introduction of why people don't really, the battlefield and the brutality of war doesn't really hit home with people. they described it this way. It says, we recognize the battlefield as a reality, but it stands as a remote one. It doesn't really touch people personally. It's like the funeral next door. The crepe on the bell pull tells there is a death in the house, and the close carriage that rolls away with muffled wheels. And in that carriage, you know that there rides a woman to whom the world is very dark now. But you only see the mourners of the last long line of carriages. They ride very jollily and at their ease, smoking cigars in a furtive and discursive manner, perhaps, and if it were not for the black gloves that they wear, which the deceased was wise and liberal enough to furnish by his inheritance, it might be a wedding for all the world would know. You can't even tell what's going on there sometimes. It attracts your attention, but it doesn't enlist your sympathy. But it is very different when the hearse stops at your own door and the corpse is carried out over your own threshold. You know whether it is a wedding or a funeral then, without looking at the color of the gloves worn. Those who lose friends in battle know what the battlefields are, and our Marylanders with their dooryards strewn with the dead and dying, and their houses turned into hospitals for the wounded, they know what battlefields are. And these are some of his pictures from the battlefields, from the Battle of Antietam. And you can see the soldiers lying there. This is how the New York Times went on to describe such scenes. It says, Mr. Brady has done something to bring home to us the terrible reality and the earnestness of war. Just like the funeral there, he says, it doesn't make an impression on you unless somebody actually put the body right on your doorstep. He says, well, if Brady has not brought bodies and laid them on our dooryards and along our streets, he has done something very like it by showing us these photographs. At the door of his gallery, where he has a display of these kind of photographs, there's a placard that says the Dead of Antietam, and this is one of the photographs from his Antietam collection. Crowds of people are constantly going up those stairs. Follow them and you'll find them bending over photographic views of that fearful battlefield taken immediately after the action. Of all the objects of horror, one would think the battlefield should stand preeminent, that it should bear away the palm of repulsiveness. Here's another one of the photographs from Antietam. It says it, and they go on to say, but on the contrary, it should be repulsive to people. It says, on the contrary, there's a terrible fascination about it that draws one near the picture and makes them loath to leave them. Even though it's difficult to look at, people will stand there and look and be loath to leave them, it says. You'll see hushed, reverent groups of people standing around these weird copies of carnage, bending down to look at the pale faces of the dead, chained by the strange spell that dwells in dead man's eyes. And every once in a while, when you're out on the street, you will see somebody take a long, hard look at our photographs like that. Sometimes they're across the street, they never even talk to you, but you can tell they're looking hard at our photographs. It is making that kind of impression on them that nothing else would. Alexander Gardner was one of the photographers employed by Brady. He later quit and founded his own studio a few months after Antietam, probably in part to put his own name on the images, and he ended up snapping the most famous photo of the Civil War dead called The Harvest of Death, and that's this photograph. It was from the battle in Gettysburg. Gardner himself wrote about this. He said, such a picture conveys a useful moral. It shows the blank horror and reality of war in opposition to the pageantry. Here are the dreadful details. Let them aid in preventing such another calamity falling upon the nation. So even though part of his motivation was to make a name for himself, he was also motivated to educate Americans about the horrors of war. Don't let this happen again. War should always be a last resort. It is definitely not something pleasant. But people can think that sitting in their armchairs. Let's go fight another war. And he wanted them to consider that before thinking that type of thing. Another man that used photography for social change was a man named Lewis Hine. He also was born in the 1800s. He actually grew up in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, and he was a school teacher before becoming a photographer. He was a New York City school teacher and photographer. He was an early reformer. He knew that a picture can tell a powerful story. He felt so strongly about the use of children as industrial workers that he ended up quitting his teaching job to become an investigative photographer for the National Child Labor Committee. He traveled constantly for the NCLC, covering as many as 50,000 miles a year by automobile and train. Child labor became an obsession to him that would give him no rest. And it wasn't a difficult life to lead. He traveled around the country with an old-fashioned box camera, taking pictures of kids at work. It took courage for him to get those pictures. There were factory owners that did not want photographers nosing around their plants, aiming cameras at underage workers. In the past, child labor investigators that did that kind of job were harassed, jailed, and run out of town. So he had to be kind of an undercover photographer of this. He was clever enough to bluff his way into many plants. He searched where he was not welcome, and he snapped scenes that were meant to be hidden from the public. At times he was in real danger, risking physical attack when factory managers realized what he was up to. He was a slender bird-like man who was usually retiring and shy, but he put his life on the line in order to record a truthful picture of working children in early 20th century America. He had to play a lot of roles to do this as an undercover photographer. He posed as a fire inspector, an insurance salesman, and an industrial photographer who was after pictures of buildings and factory materials. I'm not photographing any kids here, I'm just photographing the machinery here. So he would come into a textile mill and set up his camera to photograph a loom, and then ask a child to come stand next to it, just for scale. I just want the child in the picture just for scale. I'm really taking a picture of the machinery here. When the photograph was printed, it emphasized the fact that the worker who tended the loom was indeed a small child, so he ended up with pictures like this. I first came to know about Lewis Hine when we were doing homeschooling. We liked to read a lot of historical fiction, and one of the books we read was a historical fiction book about this character here, Addie Card, who was a 12-year-old spinner in a cotton mill in Vermont, and they built like a narrative off of that to show the kind of things that Lewis Hine would do, coming into and taking photographs. It said in the history books, it says he was careful to document every photograph with precise facts and figures. Hine knew the exact height of each button on his vest from the floor, so he could measure a child standing alongside him with no one being the wiser. So he would take a note of how tall this child was, how old this child was, just by which button she lined up to on his vest or his jacket. He hid a small pocket notebook with him, and he used it to record the name, age, hours of work, daily earnings, the schooling, and other facts about each child he photographed. And he wrote his own captions for these photographs. So this one, he wrote about Addie Card, 12 years old, an anemic little spinner in a Vermont cotton mill. Girls in the mill say she is 10 years old. She admitted to me that she was 12 and that she started during school vacation, but would stay. Probably gave up going to school and just stayed there during the school year, even though she started during vacation. It sucked her in, and she had to give up her education for that. He pointed out that boys began working as doffers in the mills when they were age 7 or younger. The doffer's job was to remove the whirling bobbins when they filled up with thread and replace them with empty ones, and many of the youngsters worked barefoot, as you can see in this picture. They did that to make it easier to climb on the huge machines so they could reach the bobbins or the broken threads. But if they weren't careful, they could fall into the moving machinery or get caught by it. The accident rate for children working in the mills was twice as high as it was for adults. They didn't have OSHA back then giving them standards of how to do, so technically they would shut down the line. The kids would jump on the machines and do this. Well, some people cut corners and said, get up there and do it while the machines are running. I mean, we're trying to make up time here and put them in a very dangerous position. His goal was to open the public's eyes to the horrors of child labor. He wanted to move people to action. Seeing is believing, said Hine. If people could see for themselves the abuses and injustice of child labor, surely they would demand laws to end those evils. The pictures of city-faced boys in coal mines and small girls tending giant machines revealed a shocking reality that most Americans had never seen before. So he had pictures like this. People were often shocked and outraged when they saw photos of young children working in mines, factories, and mills. Hine's caption that he wrote on this picture was a little spinner in South Carolina. She was tending her sides like a veteran, going both sides of this line of machines here. But after I took the photo, the overseer came up and said in an apologetic tone that was pathetic. She just happened in, he said. Then a moment later, he repeated that information. It appears that the mills are full of youngsters that just happened in or are helping sister. They don't really work here, they just happened in. We saw that all the time and got a bit skeptical about that line. This is some of the photographs he took of coal mining. This is what they call a breaker room. He took some of his most haunting photos in the dark tunnels and grimy breaker rooms. These were outside of the coal mines, but they were used to sort the coal. Boys worked a variety of jobs in the coal mines as mule drivers, couplers, runners, spraggers, or people that kind of brace things up. and gate tenders. Most of the younger boys were employed in the coal breaker rooms, like this picture. Their faces black with soot. They would sit on wooden boards placed over the coal chutes, and the coal came pouring through those chutes. And the boys had to bend over, reaching down and pick out the pieces of slate and stone they couldn't burn. So they're kind of pre-sorting the coal. But if a boy reached too far and slipped into the coal, he could be mangled or killed. And the caption on this picture, Hines said that while he was there taking these pictures, 2 breaker boys fell or were carried into the coal chute where they were smothered to death. So just in the short time that he was there, there were 2 deaths here. Here's another picture of the boys in that breaker room. Very few happy faces in that picture. It was a rough life to live through. Lewis Hines said, "I am sure that I am right in my choice of work." He once told his friend Frank Manny, "My child labor photos have already set the authorities to work to see if such things can be possible." People all over the country saw Hines' photographs in newspapers and magazines and in a steady stream of publications sent out by the National Child Labor Committee. The photos publicized what many refused to believe. They stood as graphic evidence that industrial America was exploiting his children. This is prophetic of the things people don't want to believe it. They refuse to believe that children are being murdered in our society, but the photographs help to peel that away. These pictures speak for themselves, the NCLC declared, and prove that the law is being violated. Hine actually designed pamphlets and booklets for his photo exhibits on child labor. He wrote descriptive captions for each photo, experimenting with the most effective ways to combine pictures and words. To describe this new format that he was developing, he coined the term photo story. So he was even making tracks, if you will, to pass out to people to tell them about this. Again, prefiguring the kind of work that we do on behalf of the preborn. Some of his best photos are made into stereopticon slides for use at illustrated lectures. Just like Jacob Reese did, he would go around making presentations like we're looking at today. The NCLC even loaned out slides to local groups and organizations, along with a typewritten talk, so you could give this presentation yourself. Hine himself lectured on child labor wherever the committee sent him. As he spoke, the slides were projected on a screen. The children's faces, bright and luminous in the dark of the auditorium, held his audiences spellbound as he described the hardships that the children had to endure. A newspaper reporter saw an exhibit of Hines' photos at a 1911 conference in Birmingham, Alabama. He was stunned by the power of the images. He wrote this: "There has been no more convincing proof of the absolute necessity of child labor laws than the pictures showing the suffering, the degradation, the immoral influence, and the utter lack of anything that is wholesome in the lives of these poor little wage earners. They speak more eloquently than any written work and depict a state of affairs which is terrible in its reality, terrible to encounter, terrible to admit that such things exist in civilized communities." Hines' photos were meant to shock and anger those who saw them. People say we're doing it wrong when people get upset, when they get angered. Well, they were designed to do that, and the photos of the murdered preborn are designed to do that as well. There's a point for doing that. They were intended to mobilize public opinion, and that's exactly what they did. The photos became a powerful weapon in the crusade against child labor, and no one can deny that they were extremely successful in that campaign. And people who have children that want to work today find those laws even oppressive at times. They've gone so far and been so successful at making the laws against child labor. Hines said a picture without beauty but without significance meant little to him. Like Jacob Reese before him, he believed the realism of photography was its greatest strength. Verbal reports could be challenged, but the raw evidentiary power of photography was, in Hines' view, an unrivaled lever for the social uplift. So a disturbing photo can bring about social uplift. Remember that. That's been proven out by history. This is one of the photographs from the mines he took. The caption on this one says, "Drivers and mules in a coal mine where much of the mining and carrying is done by machinery," and notice the open flame on the headlamp. So it was bright because of his flash bulb here, but they had actually carried an open flame to illuminate the mines, and they were dark. This was a picture of a boy named Vance. He was a trapper. He would open and close that door. That was basically his only job. So it says he trapped for a local West Virginia coal mine. He was paid 75 cents a day for 10 hours work. All he does is open and shut that door. Most of the time he sits there idle, waiting for the cars to come by. He said when he came in there, you could not read anything that was on that door until he saw the photograph develop later because the flash bulb had illuminated all the hieroglyphics and wording on the door. It was so dark in there beforehand. There's always a danger that the proliferation of photographs of the horrendous situations will induce what's been called compassion fatigue. People get tired of seeing these photographs. Some of the people that we've been doing this so much around the Milwaukee area that sometimes people get tired and say, we've seen you guys out here before, don't you guys ever give this up? Well, they noticed the very same thing back in 1910 there. It says, as early as 1910, a writer observed the public soon wearies of pictures of destitute children or desolate tenement interiors, and in our own area of global media, the list can seem endless of causes. Well, Lewis Hine noticed the same thing. When speaking to an audience of reformers a year earlier, Hine himself acknowledged that his listeners probably were weary of child labor pictures, but this was his answer to that. He went on to say that he was too, but he added, we propose to make you and the whole country so sick and tired of the whole business that when for the time of action comes, child labor pictures will be things of the past. So he said, rather than backing off when people said, you're overdoing it, this is too much, he said, we're going to make you sick and tired of it by constant repetition. We're not going to give up. This was a picture of a little boy named Shorby Higginbotham. He was a greaser on the tipple at Bessie Mine. This was the caption written by Hine. It was in Alabama. Said he was 14 years old, but it's doubtful. Probably wasn't that old. He carries 2 heavy pails of grease, and he's often in danger of being run over by the coal cars. Not a very safe job. This is him with some of his friends, and again, not very many happy faces in that picture. A lot of hardened faces well before their time. Lewis Hine once said, "What is when the great social peril is darkness and ignorance, what is required? Light in floods. Not just a little, but we need to hit people over the head with this. Bring light in floods." He wanted to move people to action. It's difficult to point to a single photograph by Hine that stirred the public to action. His work for the NCLC undermines the fact that photographs most often achieve their force by addition or multiplication. A single photograph may be powerful, but it seldom does the job alone. Pictorial influence tends to be cumulative, like the Chinese water drop torture, image after image of tenements, child labor, of civil rights outrages. They load down the mind until it snaps under a particularly sharp assault. Time and repetition are photography's greatest allies in the battle for influence. And that's why we design, when we go out on our tour stops, to have sign after sign after sign down the street so that it makes that kind of impact on people. One photograph generally isn't going to do it, but cumulatively it does. And we got to keep going out and showing the photographs to people. The NCLC chairman later remarked about Hine, the work that he did for reform was more responsible than all other efforts in bringing the need to public attention. The evils were intellectually but not emotionally recognized until his skill, vision, and artistic finesse focused the camera intelligently on these social problems. So we'll constantly hear people say, why don't you just talk to people? This is too upsetting to people. You're not going to be effective unless you educate people, get them saved, preach the gospel. Those are more important ways of fighting social ills. Well, it's interesting to say that no one can deny that the fight against child labor laws was not successful, but no one knows that the most impactful part of that fight was the photographs they used. That's what really turned the tide and made the most difference. So let's learn from history and not be cowed by people who tell us we're doing it wrong today. That's not what history shows. Another example of a photograph that made a tremendous impact on society was Emmett Till. He wasn't the photographer, he was the photograph. He was a young black man in 1955 when he was 15 years old. He was a northerner who came down to visit family in Mississippi and wasn't bred and grown up in the atmosphere of segregation, so perhaps didn't know how best to act around people down there. It was said that he had whistled at a white woman and was lynched for it and brutally murdered. His body was later recovered from a river. The postmortem was gruesome, and they ended up taking a photograph that was published in Jet magazine and then other black magazines, publications, but not in the white media. But it still made a huge impact. When it was paired with a portrait like this of him still alive, smiling, and happy, it made a profound impact on the entire African American community. His mother, Mamie Till, wrote a autobiographical book about the whole situation, and she gave a very detailed account the first time that she had to go into the mortuary to identify the body. And she gave this account of viewing the body in the mortuary. She said, "At a glance, the body didn't even appear human. Suddenly, as I stood there gazing down at the body, something came over me. It was like an electric shock. In fact, it was terror. I felt it to every bone in my body. Quickly, I diverted my eyes down to his feet. That's how I needed to handle it. I decided I would examine him from his feet to his head." And she goes into detail here. I'm giving you the highlights, or the lowlights, as the case may be. She says, "When I got to his chin, I saw his tongue resting there. It was huge. I never imagined that a human tongue could be that big. Maybe it was the effect of the water, since he'd been in the river for several days. They hung a ceiling fan around his neck and put him in the river after he was dead. Maybe it was the heat," she says, "but as I gazed at the tongue, I couldn't help but think that it had been choked out of his mouth. From the chin, I moved up to his right cheek. There was an eyeball hanging down there, resting on that cheek. It looked like it was still attached by the optic nerve, but it was just suspended there. She even noticed it was the right color of his eye. She said, right away, though, I had to look to the other eye, but it wasn't there. It looked like someone had taken a nut picker and plucked that one out. I looked at the bridge of his nose and at the point right between his eyebrows that had been chopped, maybe with a meat cleaver. It looked as if someone had tenderized his nose. I looked for his ear. I believe it was his right ear. There was a little curled up part on the tip of his lobe that she was looking for. But that's when she found out the right ear had been cut almost in half. The part that I was looking for wasn't there anymore. I looked at the bridge of his nose and the point between his eyebrows that had been chopped. Yeah, she's talking about that ear, the chopping that went through the point right between his eyebrows. Maybe with a meat cleaver, looked as if someone had tenderized his nose. Okay, I'm sorry. The part she was looking for, she said someone, either Millam or Bryant, the two murderers, they had either taken a hatchet and cut through some of the top of his head from ear to ear. The back of his head was loose from the front part of his face, and as they moved around, I saw a bullet hole slightly back from the temple area, and I could see light shining through that hole to the other side where the bullet had left his skull. That's when I had to stop. So she was quite descriptive on how she went through this, but she said that still wasn't enough to make an impact on people. So what she decided to do was have an open casket funeral, and the people were shocked by her decision to do that. The mortuary director was shocked by it, but he agreed to do it. This was some of the reasons she gave for making that difficult decision. She said, "I knew that I could talk for the rest of my life about what happened to my baby. I could explain it in great detail," and she just did for what we read through. But she said, "I could describe what I saw laid out there in the morning in A.A. Rayner's mortuary, one piece, 1 inch, one body part at a time. I could do all of that, and people would still not get the full impact. They would not be able to visualize what had happened unless they were able to see the results of what happened. They had to see what I had seen. The whole of the nation had to bear witness to this." She wanted people to actually experience what she did, so she had the open casket funeral, and this is what it looked like having him sit there at the funeral. And it looked better than the description that we just went through. They actually cleaned up the body for reviewing, even though she didn't ask them to. She said Mr. Rayner, the mortician, did some work to prepare him for the public viewing despite our talk. Looking back on it now, I think he probably felt he had to do something. Emmett was in such bad shape when we got him back, monstrous condition. But Mr. Rayner did what he could. That tongue had been removed, I guess, and put somewhere. The mouth was closed now, and you could see on the side of Emmett's head that some coarse thread had been used to sew pieces back together. The eye that had been dangling, that was removed too, and the eyelid closed. She said, "What I had seen was so much worse than what other people would see, and what tens of thousands of people filing past Emmett would see was still bad enough. It was enough to make men cry and women cry out. And that funeral was extremely well attended. They had to extend the length of the funeral for all the people to come and see the body. As many as 100,000 people would file past that casket during the 4 days that he lay there. She said, I was told that every 5th person or so had to be assisted. Nurses were on hand to help out. People were falling out, fainting. Extra chairs had been set up outside to assist the people who didn't have strength to go on. I could only imagine the reaction if they had seen what I had seen. She says, how else could I have made people understand something like that? Even after the viewing, so many people were left speechless. That's not just surprising. We're taught to describe things by comparison. Something we've seen, something we've done, we have to compare it to. But what did we have to compare to Emmett? Nothing in our experience, nothing in our expression. The English language is so rich with contributions from so many other languages around the world, yet it was inadequate for us when we needed it the most. We just did not have the vocabulary to describe the horror that we saw or the dread we felt in seeing it. Emmett's murderers had devised a form of brutality that not only was beyond measure, it was beyond words. And we see the same thing today with the Center for Reproductive Medicine, where they had all the underground photos of Planned Parenthood. People didn't want to hear it. The kind of degradation that's in there is beyond words, but you have to kind of see what's going on. And they definitely wanted to shut that down. William Faulkner even got into this debate after some initial reports out of Mississippi that the authorities were not going to be fair at the trial, and that the 2 murderers were actually acquitted of the murder, were not found guilty. But it wasn't known at the time the way it was going to go, but it seemed like it was going that way. So William Faulkner was from Mississippi, and he was over in Europe at the time, but he still spoke out against that. And this was a quote that he said. He says, because if in America we have reached the point in our desperate culture where we must murder children, no matter for what reason or what color, then we don't deserve to survive, and we probably won't. A little bit prophetic of the things he said. We could say the same things today. If we've reached the point in our culture where we have to murder children for whatever reason, we don't deserve to survive, and we probably won't, and I wonder if we will. With God's judgment, God is just, and his justice does not sleep, like our founding fathers said. To give you more of a contemporary example of photographs that make an impact, goes just back to 2016. Our good friend Facebook here was involved in a controversy. That never happens, does it? Well, 2016, there was a Facebook controversy over the photograph commonly known as Napalm Girl. All started with a Norwegian writer named Tom Egeland. He created a post on Facebook that featured The Terror of War, which is a Pulitzer Prize-winning photograph by Nick Hutt that showed children, including a naked 9-year-old girl named Kim Phuc, running away from a napalm attack during the Vietnam War. Egeland's post described 7 photographs that changed the history of warfare. So he had 7 different photographs in this post that he made, and Facebook took exception to it. Egeland was subsequently suspended from Facebook when Aftenposten, Norway's largest newspaper, reported on a suspension using the same photograph in its article, which was then shared on the publication's Facebook page. The newspaper received a message from Facebook asking it to either remove or pixelize the photograph. They said any photograph of people displaying fully nude genitalia or buttocks or fully nude human breast will be removed. Well, before Aftenposten could even respond, Facebook deleted the article and the image from their Facebook page. The newspaper's editor published a front-page open letter to Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg lambasting the company's decision, and these are some of the things that he said. His name was Espen Egil Hansen. He was the editor-in-chief of Aftenposten. He accused Zuckerberg of thoughtlessly abusing your power over the social media site that has become a linchpin of the distribution of news and information around the world, writing, I am upset, disappointed, well, in fact, even afraid of what you are about to do to a mainstay of our democratic society, namely the press, in this case. In his open letter, Hansen pointed out that Facebook's decision to delete the photograph revealed a troubling inability to distinguish between child pornography and famous war photographs, as well as an unwillingness to allow good space for judgment. He said, even though I am editor-in-chief of Norway's largest newspaper, I have to realize that you are restricting my room for exercising my editorial responsibility. I think you are abusing your power, and I find it hard to believe that you have thought this through thoroughly. Hansen went on to argue that rather than to fulfill its mission statement, which is make the world more open and connected, he said such editorial decisions will simply promote stupidity and fail to bring human beings closer together. Facebook initially defended its decision to remove that image, saying, while we recognize that this photo is iconic, it's difficult to create a distinction between allowing the photograph of a new child in one instance and not in others. On Friday, following widespread criticisms from news organizations and media experts across the globe, Facebook then reversed its decision, saying in a statement to the daily newspaper, after hearing from our community, we looked again at how our community standards were applied in this case. An image of a naked child would normally be presumed to violate our community standards, and in some countries might even qualify as child pornography. But in this case, we recognize the history and global importance of this image in documenting a particular moment in time. After the often post and spat, the Facebook controversy expanded when it removed a post by Erna Solberg, who was Norway's prime minister. She also published the image and called on the company to review its editing policy. Solberg said it was highly regrettable that this technology corporation has meddled with her Facebook page, an attempt she wrote to edit her common history. She said, I wish today's children would also have the opportunity to see and learn from historical mistakes and events. This is important, she wrote, adding that the post vanished while she was on a plane only hours after she posted it. Interesting note that she says, she wishes children could see this photograph because we need to learn from history. So yes, it's disturbing, but she says even children ought to be able to see it. When Egeland complained about the censorship, the company suspended his Facebook account. This is the actual photograph from 1955. It's called The Terror of War. So it shows, the photo is more commonly known as Napalm Girl, and it does show 9-year-old little girl, Kim Phuc. She was running down the street naked after a napalm attack on her village. She's literally feeling like she's burning, so she tears off all her clothes. She's running down the street saying, too hot, too hot. Her skin was melting off in strips. Her home was burning in the background. You see the cloud of smoke and debris from the napalm bomb that was dropped in a village back there. It was actually dropped by South Vietnamese troops by accident on a friendly village in a residential area, not a war area. It was June 8th, 1972 when this happened. Photographer Nick Utt snapped the picture with his spare camera. He almost didn't get the picture. Then he covered Phuc in a raincoat from a nearby soldier, trundled her into his car and drove her to the hospital, saving her life. This photo ran on the front page of practically every newspaper and magazine in the world and is credited with swaying public opinion against the war. Time has proved it not only to be the iconic photo of the Vietnam era, but one of the most haunting and memorable of the entire 20th century. Utt's editor, Horst Foss, once said, it's a picture that doesn't rest, and that's true. Interesting to note that Kim Phuc herself came out in support of this as well. She at the time lived in Canada with her husband and 2 children, more than 40 years after that. She piled on further pressure with her own powerful statement about the Facebook controversy, saying, I'm saddened by those who focus on the nudity in the historic picture rather than its powerful message that it conveys. I fully support the documentary image taken by Nick Utt as a moment of truth that captures the horror of war and its effect on innocent victims. Even Kim herself said that this photograph deserves to be seen. Interesting to note, in December of 2017, she wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal telling her the effect that this has had on her life, and she said the emotional scars were worse than the physical scars, and she said still, over 40 years later, she still needs treatment for the burns in her arms, back, and neck, but she says her heart is healed today. She said, I realized the same bombs that caused so much pain and suffering also brought me to a place of great healing. Those bombs led me to Jesus Christ. She said, my faith in Jesus Christ is what has enabled me to forgive those who wronged me, no matter how severe those wrongs were. Faith also inspired me to pray for my enemies rather than to curse them. It has enabled me not only to tolerate those who wronged me, but to actually love them. After the controversy was reported in the UK newspaper The Guardian, the internet saw a mini insurrection with defiant Facebook users sharing the photo in protest and against an apparently ham-fisted censorship. Some 180,000 people used Facebook to view the Guardian's account of the row, that's British for argument, illustrated paradoxically with the same uncensored photo, and another 4,000 shared it on Facebook. So people were fighting back against the censorship there and admitting that this photograph does need to be seen. So you've seen that it's been used in history over and over, photographs, even disturbing photographs to bring about social change. I want to give a little footnote here about the impact on children, because that's the next question or next complaint that usually comes up is, what about kids seeing these signs? People shouldn't be showing these signs to children. Well, Voice of the Martyrs, interestingly, had the same type of complaints against them when they published photographs of Christian persecution in foreign countries. They would publish photographs like this. This comes from 2008. It was a young girl. It says, the article that they published this in says, for 2 months in 2008, Hindu radicals attacked and killed Christians with abandon in India's Odisha state. During one attack, radicals threw a bomb into 10-year-old Namrata Nayak's home as she hid in the bathroom. She was severely burned, over 40% of her body, and Voice of the Martyrs helped provide medical care. And you can see the before and after pictures here, so they actually were able to repair the damage done to her face there. Namrata, and after the attack, it says Namrata decided to dedicate her life to sharing the gospel. Now, interestingly, they wrote and said they received a lot of feedback from readers of their newsletter. President Voice of the Martyrs at the time was Tom White. He later ended his life in scandal, but I think he had some rather insightful comments to share about this whole controversy they went through. A couple different viewpoints he shared. He said, one, we received an email from a reader disturbed that his children had seen the photo on their newsletter cover of Namrata, the Indian girl whose face was burned by Hindu radicals. Although we also showed her healed face and printed her victorious story, the reader wrote, I have 2 small children at home who see the mail and they do not understand this. It'll be difficult for me to support you if this is what I can expect. We do not need this type of cheap, graphic, emotionally driven visual play to get us involved. If you do not want my support, then simply let me know you plan to continue with this type of marketing. That would be it. So very terse email, concerned that they were really harming his children by publishing this photograph. Well, he said that same day, we received an email from a family whose children were affected entirely differently by the same photograph. This man wrote, we received the April edition in the mail today. Our 5-year-old son Gideon saw the little girl on the cover of the magazine with her many burns. Gideon had an eventful night because of seeing it lying on our tabletop. He and Benjamin, our 3-year-old, brought it to us and asked what happened to her. So I told him, well, big sigh, this little girl is 10 years old and she loves Jesus, but where she lives in her country, they don't think it's okay to love Jesus. So when other people found out that she's a Christian, and I told them what that means, they tried to hurt her. Later on, we prayed before Ben, and he said, I think God wants me to be a missionary doctor because I could go to help these people who love him and get punished for it. So when a dad takes the time to explain at the age level that his children can understand what this is all about, they don't respond with horror, they respond with compassion. You find that many times when people see the photographs. Usually it's not the kids that are crying out on the street, it's the parents that are all upset. If a child comes up to one of our photographs, they're going to be curious, they're going to look at it. And I've never seen a child upset out on the street. I've seen them curious about our signs, however. In 2011, they had published this photograph on their cover and again went through the same type of controversy over it. This was in January 2011. They featured a picture of Yubelina from Indonesia. Yubelina is a Christian woman who was burned in a fire during a Muslim attack on her village. Voice of the Martyrs again received emails both of outrage and of support. And some of them, even the supportive ones, were worried about, how are kids going to take this? Is it right to show these to children? Well, Tom White again, who was president at the time, decided to try an experiment and see, is this really as bad as people say about children seeing these images? So he says, after getting permission from some Sunday school teachers, he conducted a survey in Sunday school classes with 5 to 8-year-olds to see what their response would be to this photograph. He says, first I sat with the children and shared how a lady named Eubelina was burned because she loved Jesus. I told them how we were helping her. After this introduction, I turned over the newsletter to show them Eubelina's face. No one cringed. On the contrary, they were intensely curious. Their comments were, pray for her, help her. What happened to her eye? Jesus told the blind man to go to the river. This makes me sad. How can we help her? A boy named Joseph had such concern in his voice that I asked him if he would pray for Eubelina, and he offered a simple, touching prayer. These are the kind of responses you get from children if the parents will describe this and explain it sensitively. I think maybe some of the parents that say their children are all upset about this are upset because their parents are unhinged and swearing at us and angrier than they've seen them maybe in a long time. That may have more of an effect on the children than the photographs. They're probably just curious. How many people have been out on the streets and asked something like, what happened to that baby, or what happened to that baby's eye, or whatever. Same type of comments they got about this photograph. They're not disturbed initially. They're curious. They want to know, and you can just like talking about the birds and the bees. You don't have to give them every detail at the beginning of their honest question. You tell them what is age appropriate and as much information as they need to know, and they get it. So if you do show your children graphic images from the time they're young, I think they end up growing up to be teens like this. Not the kind that are shy about the abortion Holocaust, kids that are actually involved in the fight and willing to stand up for the things that are right. If you isolate your kids and don't tell them about it, you may end up with kids like this, totally unaware of what's going on in the culture, playing video games all the time instead. In that first Voice of the Martyrs article with Namrata Nayak, President Tom White gave this poem to illustrate some of the feelings that people have about difficult things. There was a poem by a man named Wilbur Reese called $3 Worth of God. It goes, I would like to buy $3 worth of God, please. Not enough to explode my soul or disturb my sleep, but just enough to equal a cup of warm milk or a snooze in the sunshine. I don't want enough of God to make me love a black man or pick beets with a migrant. I want ecstasy, not transformation. I want the warmth of the womb, not a new birth. I want a pound of the eternal in a paper sack. I'd like to buy $3 worth of God, please. So Tom White goes on to say, in summary of this whole thing, he says, perhaps how we view published images of persecuted Christians, or the aborted, or the murdered preborn for that matter, some consider them to be too graphic and poor taste or sensational journalism, while others see an opportunity for fellowship and love. It all could depend on how much of the cross we have been taught to carry. $3 worth of the cross does not include the sharp emotions of grief and pain. We can starve ourselves, our congregations, and our Christian denominations if our sackful of God is too small. And unfortunately, we see that. We've been going out and doing some of the Church Repent Project, where we'll go out to churches as people are going in to try to reach them. And you can tell a lot of times when the congregation is being starved for the Word of God in the way they react when we're out there. But let's keep up the fight. These pictures are effective, and people throughout history have used them to great effect. We pray the same will happen today. Let's close in prayer. Lord, we thank you that you have given us an effective tool in the fight against abortion, the photographs of the murdered preborn. I ask that you encourage us, Lord, as that we will not grow weary in well-doing as we go out and talk about the Holocaust that's going on in our midst, and the gospel that's going to help heal it as well. It goes hand in hand with it. And as people see the photographs, that's one of the things they think about. Do they need to submit to God in all of this? And we get to preach the gospel to them as well. We pray that more eyes would be open, both to the plight of the preborn and to the gospel, that they'd come to know you. Thank you that you have saved us and given us compassion for the least of these. Let's Pray, Lord, that you'll give us wisdom and courage for the days ahead, and help us to stay in the fight and not grow weary in well-doing. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.